The night is quiet. Too quiet. Imagine yourself lying awake in a darkened room. Outside, the city hums faintly, a passing car, the distant bark of a dog, the slow tick of a clock on the wall. Yet what keeps you awake is not the noise. It's a feeling. A sudden thought. A certainty you cannot explain. You know with no evidence, no sound, no logic, that your phone is about to buzz. And then it does. Coincidence? Perhaps. But in that instant, the human mind feels like more than just a lump of flesh and neurons. It feels like an antenna tuned to invisible frequencies, pulling whispers from a realm science has not yet mapped. For as long as we've told stories, humanity has been haunted by this possibility, that there is more to the mind than memory and reason, more than synapses firing in the dark. That perhaps, just perhaps, our minds can reach beyond themselves, to read the thoughts of others, to glimpse the future before it arrives, to know without knowing how we know. This, in its simplest form, is extrasensory perception, ESP. Think of the ancient oracle, staring into smoke and declaring the fate of kings. Think of a mother who wakes in the middle of the night, certain something has happened to her child across the ocean. Think of the soldier in the field, whose life is spared because he feels without proof the moment he must duck. Are these only tricks of chance and coincidence? Or evidence of some hidden, untapped sense? The debate has raged for millennia. Priests and shamans swore it was divine. Skeptics scoffed that it was fraud. Scientists tried to measure it with cards, dice, and endless experiments. Governments secretly poured money into testing it, hoping the mind itself might become a weapon. Meanwhile, ordinary people continued to dream, to feel, to just know. In ways no laboratory could explain away. And so we arrive at the threshold of this story. A story of wonder and doubt, of visions and hoaxes, of seekers and skeptics. This is not just the history of ESP. It is the history of our deepest longing to believe that we are more than flesh, more than chance, more than fragile beings, bound by the prison of our senses. The question has never gone away. And perhaps it never will. So shall we step inside the mystery. Chapter 1. The Whisper of the Unknown. The story begins not with evidence or data, but with a feeling so strange and so familiar that we rarely know what to do with it. You have felt it before. Almost everyone has. That prickling on the back of your neck when you are certain someone is watching you, and when you turn, there they are. The sudden thought of an old friend out of the blue, and minutes later their name appears in a message. The dream so vivid it lingers all morning, only to echo eerily in reality days later. These are not stories of ghosts or magic. They are stories of the mind. And they are older than history itself. Picture a camp on the edge of a great forest, 20,000 years ago. A fire burns, its smoke curling upward, carrying the smell of charred wood into the night. A family huddles close, listening to the hiss and snap of burning pine. Beyond the firelight, the world is a black ocean of sound, branches groaning, animals stirring, a predator waiting. One man, eyes closed, suddenly shudders. He cannot explain why, but his hand grips his spear. Seconds later, a shadow streaks from the trees, a wolf, desperate and lean. The man is ready. He thrusts before thought can catch up, and the wolf falls. How did he know? Was it instinct sharpened by generations of survival? Or did something else whisper across the darkness? The line between instinct and intuition has always been thin. For our ancestors, it was a matter of life and death. And when something saved a life but could not be explained, it was given a name, vision, foresight, a sixth sense. Entire cultures built rituals around it. Shamans drank bitter brews to open their minds to the unseen. Oracles gazed into smoke or water, claiming to hear voices beyond mortal ears. Prophets dreamed of futures that kings feared and followed. Whether or not the visions were true, they changed the course of lives, of wars, of empires. And the stories have never stopped. Centuries later, in a quieter, candlelit room, a woman in Victorian London wakes from a dream drenched in sweat. She saw her brother, a soldier far away, bleeding on a battlefield. She writes it down, her hand trembling. Weeks later, the letter arrives. He died exactly as she dreamt. Such tales filled diaries, newspapers, and hushed conversations over tea. Skeptics laughed, called it chance, the law of large numbers. If enough people dream, one will match reality. But does that diminish the weight of the single dream that comes true? For the dreamer, coincidence feels too small a word. It is not only in dreams. In September 1914, at the height of the First World War, a British officer wrote of a strange feeling during battle in France. He had been standing exposed, when suddenly a pressure in his chest urged him to step aside. He obeyed without thought. A shell landed exactly where he had been standing. To his dying day, he insisted it was not chance, but something else, something that pulled him away from death. How many soldiers have told the same story in whispers? How many lives saved by what they could only call a hunch? Science tried to measure such whispers. In the 1930s, psychologist J.B. Rhine at Duke University designed a simple test. Zinner cards 5 symbols: a circle, a star, 3 wavy lines, a square, a cross. One person drew a card. Another, without seeing it, guessed. Over thousands of trials, some guessed at chance level. But others, Rhine swore, scored far above it. Was it proof? To believers, yes. To skeptics, it was flawed statistics, a failure to control conditions, the eager eye of a scientist seeing what he wished to see. Yet Ryan's experiments lit a fire. ESP was no longer only the province of prophets and poets. It was now on the laboratory table. Governments noticed. In the Cold War years, as nuclear missiles rattled in silos and satellites blinked in orbit, both the United States and the Soviet Union funneled secret funds into research on the paranormal. Could a soldier, blindfolded, describe an enemy base thousands of miles away? Could a psychic foresee a crisis before it began? In dimly lit rooms, intelligence officers watched as men and women closed their eyes, breathing slowly, describing visions. Sometimes, they got details eerily correct. Other times, they were wildly wrong. The results were never clear enough to satisfy science, but never weak enough to stop funding entirely. For decades, ESP lived in the shadows of military budgets, a possibility too tempting to dismiss. But beyond the governments, the experiments, the statistics, the mystery remains most alive in the ordinary. A mother waking in the night. A phone call sensed before it arrives. A life spared by an inexplicable turn of the head. These moments lodge in memory because they feel different from dreams or guesses. They feel charged, electric, as if the world itself brushed against us. We try to explain them away. We tell ourselves we are pattern-seeking creatures, and coincidence is inevitable. But when it happens to us, the explanation rarely quiets the shiver. And so the question lingers, what if the human mind is not sealed inside the skull? What if thought is not only electrical sparks inside the brain, but something that ripples outward, touching others, touching the future? Science is cautious. It demands evidence, repeatability, numbers that resist chance. But humans are not built on caution alone. We are built on wonder. The same wonder that once stared into the fire and whispered of danger still stirs in us when the phone rings at the exact moment we thought it would. I must ask you directly, have you felt it? Not once, but often enough to question. The sudden certainty that bends your stomach into knots. The strange dream that leaves you unsettled, only to see it mirrored in waking life. The decision you cannot explain that turns out to save you. If you have, you are not strange. You are human. Across cultures, across centuries, millions have claimed the same. Belief is not proof. But belief is the ember that keeps the fire alive. Without belief, there would be no search, no tests, no debates. Without belief, there would be no story. And this story of whispers, visions, and minds reaching beyond themselves is only beginning. The whisper of the unknown has never been silenced. It followed us from the flickering fires of prehistory to the parlor tables of the 19th century, from the battlefields of Europe to the laboratories of America, from the secrets of Cold War intelligence to the phones glowing in our hands. It is not just about reading minds or foretelling the future. It is about the human refusal to accept boundaries, to believe against reason and against odds that there is more than five senses, more than flesh, more than what we can measure. The whisper is not proof, but it is the promise that maybe, just maybe, our minds are greater than we dare to imagine. And with that promise, we step into the labyrinth of history, science, and story. The journey has only begun. Chapter 2: Ancient Dreams and Oracles. The ancients did not separate the natural from the supernatural the way we do today. For them, the world was thick with meaning. Every gust of wind, every bird's flight, every dream was a possible message from beyond. And nowhere was this conviction stronger than in the belief that some human minds could pierce the veil of time and space. They did not call it extrasensory perception. They called it prophecy, divination, vision. But the essence was the same, the possibility that humans could know what they should not know. Imagine walking into the Temple of Apollo at Delphi in Greece. The air is heavy with incense, sweet and acrid all at once. Sunlight cuts through narrow slits in the stone, painting golden stripes across the floor. Pilgrims wait, murmuring prayers, their hands clutching tokens brought from faraway lands. In the heart of the temple sits the Pythia, the oracle. She sways gently, her eyes half closed, her lips moving in a rhythm that does not match ordinary speech. Around her, priests lean in, straining to catch each word, to shape it into something intelligible. Kings, generals, and commoners alike traveled across mountains and seas to hear these whispers, believing they came not from a woman, but from Apollo himself. And sometimes, the words seem to reach beyond the present into futures yet unseen. Croesus, king of Lydia, once asked if he should wage war on Persia. The oracle replied, "If you go to war, you will destroy a great empire." Croesus took it as encouragement. He fought, and indeed, a great empire fell his own. Was this foresight? Was it cunning ambiguity dressed as prophecy? Or was it something more, an unconscious gift, a pattern of mind that glimpsed possibilities before they unfolded? The Greeks were hardly alone. In Mesopotamia, among the world's first great cities, clay tablets record the meticulous rituals of diviners. They examined the livers of sacrificed animals, reading the shapes and markings as one might read a map. To us, it seems superstition. But consider this: those priests lived in a world where survival hinged on predicting floods, harvests, invasions. They believed the gods left messages in every detail, waiting for someone to listen. And sometimes, the predictions aligned with reality. Did chance and human memory exaggerate their accuracy? Perhaps. But for those who believed, the coincidence was confirmation. The world spoke, and some could hear. Dreams were perhaps the oldest and most intimate form of prophecy. Across cultures, they were portals to truth. Egyptians kept dream books, guides that explained what it meant to see a crocodile or a rising sun in sleep. In the Hebrew Bible, Joseph dreamed of fat and lean cows, symbols of years of plenty and famine. His visions saved Egypt from disaster. Was it divine intervention or a subconscious ability to sense patterns others missed? Dreams are born in the brain, yet they often feel as though they come from somewhere else. When a dream coincides with reality, the result is electrifying, impossible to shake. And so, in the ancient world, dreams were rarely dismissed as random. They were taken seriously, consulted before decisions, recorded as omens. Travel further east, and we find shamans in Siberia beating drums under star-studded skies, their bodies swaying as they inhale the smoke of burning herbs. Their breathing slows, their eyes glaze, and they claim to fly beyond their bodies into realms unseen. There, they ask spirits for guidance about the hunt, the harvest, the health of the tribe. In the jungles of the Amazon, medicine men drink bitter brews that pull visions from the shadows of the mind. In these visions, they claim to see dangers, cures, enemies, futures. To their people, these were not parlor tricks, but sacred duties. To ignore them was to risk death. And what of the Celts, who spoke of druids seeing the future in the flight of birds, the shape of clouds, the murmur of streams? Or the Chinese, who inscribed cracks on oracle bones, heating them until they split and reading the fractures as messages from ancestors? The details differ, but the impulse is universal. Across every continent, humans insisted that reality was porous, that knowledge could seep through from elsewhere, if only one knew how to look or how to listen. The skeptic in us might dismiss it all as cultural imagination, ritualized chance, or the human hunger for control in an uncontrollable world. Yet even the skeptic must pause at the persistence of the pattern. Why did every civilization, separated by oceans and centuries, invent such similar practices? Why did every culture place such faith in the possibility that some humans could see beyond sight? Is it merely coincidence or a reflection of something deeper in the human mind, something we have yet to fully understand? Take, for example, the battlefield at Marathon in 490 BCE. Greek soldiers, exhausted and terrified, stood against the Persians. As legend tells, some claim to see the ghostly figure of a hero from centuries past fighting beside them. Whether vision, hallucination, or mass belief, it emboldened them. They won against impossible odds. Here lies another truth. Prophecy and vision are not only about predicting events. They are about shaping belief, and belief shapes history. If a general believes the gods have promised victory, he fights harder. If a people believe a prophet's warning, they prepare for famine. In this way, visions, real or imagined, change the future simply by being believed. Consider Socrates again, with his inner voice. He called it a daimonion, a guiding spirit that never urged him forward but always warned him away from error. To modern ears, It sounds like conscience. Yet Socrates insisted it was not his own reasoning. It was something other, something that spoke when he least expected it. Perhaps it was a sharpened intuition, the subconscious bubbling into awareness. But if so, why did he experience it as a voice, external, alien, yet trusted? Here, again, the line blurs between psychology and the paranormal, between instinct and extrasensory perception. Now, close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself as an ordinary farmer in ancient times. The night is still, the fields dark, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth. You dream of locusts swarming, stripping crops bare. You wake sweating, unsettled. Weeks later, the swarm comes, exactly as in your dream. You tell your neighbors, and they remember. From that moment on, you are the one they consult before planting, before war, before marriage. You never claim to be special, but they insist you are. And perhaps, after enough coincidences, you start to wonder too. This is how prophets are born, not from certainty, but from repetition, from the accumulation of whispers too precise to ignore. Some were revered. Others were feared. Many were both. To dream of the future was a gift, but it was also a burden, for if the future could be seen, then it could not always be changed. And those who bore such visions lived with the weight of inevitability. The ancients never argued whether ESP existed. For them, it was fact. The debate was not if, but how through gods, spirits, ancestors, or fate. Only later, with the rise of science, would the question shift into skepticism. But in those early ages, no farmer, soldier, or king would have doubted that some people could see beyond sight. And that belief shaped the world. Empires rose and fell on the words of oracles. Wars began and ended on the basis of visions. Ordinary lives were steered by dreams, and dreams in turn shaped history. So we stand at the threshold of an ancient truth, that the human mind has always strained against its limits, always reached for glimpses beyond. Whether ESP is real in the way modern science demands is one question. But whether humans have believed in it, have lived and died by it, is undeniable. And in that belief, a paradox emerges. For if enough people believe that a vision is true, then the vision shapes reality, and the future, in some sense, comes to pass. The ancients did not think of this as coincidence. They thought of it as destiny. Chapter 3. Visions of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages were an age of paradox. On one hand, faith reigned supreme. Cathedrals rose like mountains of stone, their stained glass windows casting holy light across the faithful. On the other, shadows crowded every corner, plague, famine, sudden death, and the constant whisper of demons. In such a world, where life was precarious and the unseen seemed always at work, belief in visions and supernatural knowledge flourished. But unlike in ancient times, where oracles were celebrated, the medieval world cast suspicion. A vision might come from God or from the devil. And how could anyone tell the difference? Imagine a monastery in the 12th century. The air is heavy with candle smoke and the faint tang of parchment ink. A monk kneels in his cell, his lips murmuring prayer. Suddenly, he sees a figure, radiant with light, speaking words he cannot hear but somehow understands. He rushes to his abbot, trembling, certain he has received a divine vision. If the abbot believes him, the monk may rise in reputation, his words recorded, his vision shaping the monastery's course. But if the abbot suspects delusion, or worse, diabolical deception, the monk may be punished, silenced, or branded a heretic. In this uncertainty, every vision became dangerous. And yet, visions were everywhere. Saints were said to hear voices guiding them. Street. Joan of Arc, centuries later, claimed she was led by voices from heaven, telling her to save France from English domination. She followed them, rallying an army, winning battles, and altering the fate of nations. Was she mad? Inspired? Or did she hear something beyond ordinary perception? Her judges, skeptical and fearful, condemned her as a heretic. Centuries later, the Church declared her a saint. History leaves us with the haunting question: how does one separate madness, intuition, and divine ESP? Dreams, too, carried weight in the medieval imagination. But unlike the ancients, Christians viewed them with suspicion. To dream was to open oneself to forces unknown, and not all forces were holy. Manuals circulated warning monks and nuns that dreams could be the devil's tricks, luring the soul into sin. And yet, not all dreams were condemned. Some were embraced as revelations. Hildegard of Bingen, a German abbess, described luminous visions of cosmic harmony and divine light. Her works were revered, even sought out by emperors and popes. Her visions guided theology, music, medicine. Here was a woman who claimed to see truths no mortal could know, and the Church, unusually, believed her. But for every Hildegard, countless others were silenced. Women who claimed prophetic gifts risked being labeled witches. A farmer's wife who dreamt of a neighbor's misfortune, spoke it aloud, might find herself accused of sorcery if that misfortune came true. Fear and awe lived side by side. ESP-like abilities were a dangerous gift in the Middle Ages, one that could elevate a person to sainthood or drag them to the stake. Picture a medieval village in winter. The night is bitter, smoke curling from chimneys, the smell of burning peat mixing with frost. Inside a cottage, a mother whispers to her child of a dream. She had crows circling above the village. The next week, plague arrives, sweeping through the streets. Her neighbors whisper that she knew. Some say she is blessed. Others say she is cursed. In an age when explanations were scarce and suffering constant, the human hunger to make sense of the unknown magnified every coincidence, every dream, every strange intuition. And there were the stories of second sight, passed down in Celtic lands. In the Highlands of Scotland, some were said to possess the gift of seeing what others could not: death omens, phantom funerals, visions of travelers yet to arrive. To see such things was no blessing. It was a burden, for knowledge of death could not prevent it. The Gaelic word for this gift was Tibseracht, second sight. Even centuries later, belief in it persisted. It was not framed as ESP in the modern sense, but the essence was identical: the idea that some human minds pierced a veil invisible to others. Skeptics existed even then. Learned men in universities, rediscovering Aristotle and building the foundations of scholastic thought, argued that visions might be illusions of the senses, products of imbalance in the body's humors, or tricks of the devil. They sought rational explanations, though rational. In the Middle Ages, often meant theological reasoning rather than scientific method. Still, the seeds of skepticism were there, hinting at the coming clash between reason and belief in later centuries. But one cannot escape how deeply visions shaped the medieval world. Entire pilgrimages began because a peasant dreamed of a saint's relic hidden beneath a field. Wars were fought because commanders claimed divine visions assured them of victory. Monarchs kept astrologers and prophets in their courts, despite the church's warnings. And ordinary people, living in fear of death and damnation, clung to any sign, any dream, any intuition that suggested the world was not wholly chaotic, that some pattern, some meaning could be grasped. Close your eyes and imagine a medieval church during Mass. The incense is thick, golden light streams through stained glass, and the congregation kneels in silence. Suddenly, a woman cries out, claiming to see an angel hovering above the altar. Gasps ripple through the crowd. Some drop to their knees, awed. Others glare with suspicion. Later, priests will debate, was she blessed or possessed? In that uncertainty lies the heart of the medieval approach to ESP-like phenomena, a mixture of reverence and fear, of desperate belief and crushing suspicion. The Middle Ages may seem distant, but the questions they wrestled with remain the same as ours. When a vision proves true, is it coincidence, intuition, divine revelation, or evidence of a mind reaching beyond the limits of time and space? When a dream foretells tragedy, is it prophecy or the cruel pattern seeking of memory? And when someone claims to hear voices, how do we decide whether they are inspired, ill, or something else entirely? For the medieval mind, the answer depended on context. If the voices led to holiness, they might be divine. If they led to disobedience or chaos, they were satanic. Rarely was the possibility entertained that they were natural, emerging from the brain itself. That question would come later, in the Age of Reason. But in the shadow of the cathedral, visions were never neutral. They were evidence of a world where God and the devil vied for souls, where every dream might be a battlefield. And so, the Middle Ages gave ESP no scientific name. But it lived, woven into the stories of saints, the fears of villagers, the accusations of witch trials, and the whispered tales of second sight. It was both exalted and condemned, a flicker of possibility that could change lives or end them. The whisper of the unknown had not faded. It had only changed its mask. Chapter 4: The Age of Reason versus the Irrational. The 17th century dawned with a new confidence. Telescopes peered into the heavens, revealing moons around Jupiter and spots on the sun. Microscope lenses, polished with care, exposed invisible worlds of wriggling life in a drop of water. Mathematics blossomed into a universal language, promising to explain the motions of planets, the fall of apples, the mechanics of blood coursing through veins. It was an age that promised reason could pierce every mystery. And yet, amid this explosion of knowledge, the old whispers endured. Dreams, visions, strange intuitions, phenomena we might call ESP, today refused to vanish. Instead, they lived in tension with reason. Scholars denounced them as superstition, but kings still consulted astrologers in secret. Philosophers scoffed, but families still whispered of dreams that came true. The irrational bent but never broke. Picture London in the mid-1600s. The air is thick with the smoke of coal fires and the smell of damp wool. Crowds jostle in narrow alleys, debating politics and plague with equal fervor. At night, under flickering candlelight, salons gather. Men in wigs discuss Newton's laws, while in the next breath, a lady shares a dream she swears foretold her cousin's death. Reason and superstition sit side by side, uneasily sharing the same table. One story, repeated across Europe, tells of premonitions of disaster. In 1664, a Dutch clergyman named Abraham de la Prime dreamt of the collapse of a church tower. Days later, the tower fell. His account, recorded in his diary, spread quickly, fueling both belief and ridicule. Rationalists declared it coincidence. Believers called it proof of divine or extrasensory sight. What mattered was not who was right, but that the debate itself persisted, showing how fragile the Enlightenment's grip on mystery truly was. The Enlightenment prided itself on challenging the old. Voltaire, ever the wit, mocked visions and prophecies as relics of ignorance. Diderot, champion of reason, dismissed oracles and prophets as frauds. But even they could not erase the stories that slipped through the cracks. Too many people, across too many places, reported moments of uncanny knowledge. And if the mind was capable of so much calculus, astronomy, invention, who was to say it was not capable of more? Meanwhile, spiritual practices adapted to the new language of science. Instead of speaking of gods and demons, some thinkers spoke of animal magnetism or invisible fluids that connected minds and bodies. Franz Mesmer, in the late 18th century, mesmerized audiences literally. Patients sat in darkened rooms, holding rods connected to vats of magnetized water, convinced they felt mysterious energies flow through them. Mesmer claimed these forces could heal, perhaps even allow communication beyond ordinary senses. The scientific establishment laughed him into scandal, but the public was captivated. In Mesmer's dimly lit chambers, lit by candlelight and filled with hushed anticipation, we glimpse an early attempt to bridge reason and the irrational, to explain ESP not with gods but with science's own tools. Across the Atlantic, in colonial America, visions and premonitions carried weight too. Ministers warned that dreams might be snares of Satan, but congregations still whispered about them. The Salem witch trials were fueled in part by visions girls claimed to see specters invisible to others, pointing trembling fingers at neighbors. In courtrooms, testimony of unseen perceptions condemned men and women to death. Here, ESP-like phenomena were not curiosities but deadly accusations. Reason insisted the senses alone revealed truth. The irrational whispered that hidden senses revealed danger. Lives were caught in between. And yet, not all was persecution. In England, the Society for Psychical Research began to emerge by the late 18th and early 19th centuries, collecting reports of dreams, visions, and apparitions. They treated them not as theology, but as data, however crude. It was an early, clumsy step toward what would become parapsychology. Even as Enlightenment thinkers declared the world mechanical, others insisted that hidden layers remained. Let us step into the drawing room of a wealthy Parisian home in the 1700s. Velvet curtains hang heavy, muffling the sounds of the city outside. Guests sip wine, debating Rousseau's latest writings. A woman speaks suddenly, her voice trembling, telling of a vision she had the night before, a carriage accident near the Seine. The guests laugh, teasing her for superstition. But days later, news spreads. A carriage indeed overturned on the riverbank, eerily resembling her dream. The same guests now whisper differently. Reason cannot fully silence awe. The age of reason sought to banish mystery, but in doing so, it magnified it. Every failed prediction, every false vision, was another nail in superstition's coffin. And yet every dream that came true, every uncanny hunch, glowed brighter against the backdrop of skepticism. ESP became not only a question of belief, but a question of identity. Were we merely rational creatures of logic and bone, or something more? Could the mind, so skilled at mathematics and invention, also reach across time and space. By the dawn of the 19th century, the tension was palpable. Science marched forward with steam engines and electricity, yet seances and visions were waiting just around the corner, ready to seize imaginations anew. The rational world thought it had won. But history, like the mind, is never so simple. The whisper of the unknown had not been silenced. It had merely changed its language. Chapter 5: Victorian Seances and the Rise of Spiritualism. The 19th century arrived wrapped in paradox. It was an age of steam engines and telegraphs, of factories grinding out iron and coal, of science advancing with dizzying speed. Yet alongside the rational march of progress, a hunger for mystery grew stronger than ever. If machines could carry voices across wires, if invisible waves could carry messages through the air, why could not the mind itself reach across the invisible? If electricity crackled unseen through copper, why not thought itself across space and time? Enter the seance. Imagine a Victorian parlor in London, the curtains drawn against the gaslit street outside. The air is thick with perfume, candle smoke, and anticipation. Chairs are arranged around a polished table. Hands rest lightly, fingertips barely touching the wood. A medium, pale and trembling, begins to hum, her breath shallow, her eyes rolling back. The flame flickers. The table shudders. And in the hush, a knock sounds from nowhere. A widow gasps. "Is that you, Henry?" Her grief weaponized into faith. In that moment, ESP, mediumship, and mystery blur into one. The Fox sisters of Hydesville, New York, lit the spark. In 1848, two young girls, Margaret and Kate, claimed they could summon spirits through a series of mysterious rappings on the walls. What began as a game grew into a phenomenon. Neighbors flocked, skeptical at first, then awed as the raps seemed to answer questions. Soon, the sisters were performing for crowds, the air buzzing with both belief and suspicion. Spiritualism was born. And with it came the seance craze. Parlors across America and Europe, filled with whispers, knocks, table turnings, and claims of visions. To some, this was proof of ESP, the mind reaching into unseen realms. Mediums described spirits passing messages, revealing secrets no one should know. They told grieving parents the names of their lost children, whispered words only the dead had spoken. Audiences gasped, convinced they were witnessing proof that the soul could transcend death, and that some minds could perceive what others could not. To skeptics, it was theater. They exposed sleight of hand, hidden wires, accomplices lurking in shadows. Magicians like Harry Houdini later dedicated their lives to unmasking fraud, demonstrating how every vision and knock could be faked. But even Houdini admitted what drove people to believe was not gullibility alone, it was longing. The industrial age had stripped life of mystery, and spiritualism offered it back, candlelit and trembling. Not all who claimed such gifts were frauds. Some believed sincerely in their powers, convinced their visions were real. Daniel Douglas Home, perhaps the most famous medium of the age, was said to levitate in front of witnesses, rising slowly above the floorboards, while aristocrats gaped in astonishment. He never charged money, unlike many others, and those who saw him swore he could not be faking. Was it trickery so skilled no one could catch him, or was it something stranger? ESP in this age was dressed in velvet and lace. Parapsychology had not yet emerged as a discipline, but seances provided fertile ground. Telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, words not yet fully formalized, swirled around the seance table. A widow believed her husband whispered through the medium. A mother swore her child spoke from the beyond. The emotional weight was immense, and in that weight, belief thrived. But the Victorians were also fascinated by science. Scientists, curious and skeptical, sometimes attended seances themselves. Sir William Crookes, a respected chemist and physicist, investigated mediums, convinced that even if fraud abounded, something genuine might lurk beneath. He tested Florence Cook, a young medium, who claimed to materialize a spirit called Katie King. Crookes swore he touched her, saw her, even photographed her. Skeptics ridiculed him, declaring he had been duped. But Crookes, a man of reason, insisted he had encountered something beyond explanation. This was the paradox of the age. A world enamored with progress, with locomotives shrieking across countryside and telegraphs tapping across continents, still clung to candlelit rooms where tables rapped and voices whispered. The Victorians could not decide, was ESP the final superstition of a fading world, or the first glimmer of a hidden science? And then there were the private stories, the whispers that never made the newspapers but lived in diaries and drawing rooms. A man dreams of a ship sinking at sea, only to learn the next day of a disaster on the Atlantic. A woman wakes with dread, convinced her sister has died, and hours later the telegram confirms it. These were the kinds of tales that fueled seances, not experiments, not statistics, but lived moments that demanded explanation. In truth, the seances were both theater and something more. Fraud was rampant, but belief was real. And belief itself can create its own truth. A grieving widow who believes she has spoken to her husband may live differently afterward, consoled, reassured, convinced. In that sense, ESP in the Victorian age was not merely about proof. It was about meaning. Close your eyes for a moment and picture yourself there. You are seated in a darkened parlor, your hand resting lightly on the polished table. The air is still, except for the nervous breaths of those around you. The medium begins to hum, her body trembling. Suddenly, the table creaks, rising an inch, then two. A draft sweeps across your face, though no window is open. A voice, faint and whispering, calls your name. Your heart pounds. You tell yourself it cannot be real. And yet, in the moment, you believe. The Victorians believed in reason, but they also believed in the heart. And the heart demanded more than steam engines and telegraphs. It demanded whispers from beyond, flashes of impossible knowledge, minds that reached across the dark. By the end of the 19th century, spiritualism had spread across continents, from Boston to Paris, London to Rome. It enthralled, it deceived, it consoled. It planted seeds that would bloom into the first laboratories of parapsychology, where ESP would be tested with cards and dice. But before science claimed it, ESP belonged to the seance table, to the candlelit parlor, to the trembling hands of mediums who promised more than 5 senses could deliver. The whisper of the unknown had found a new stage. Chapter 6: War and Prophecy. War is the great accelerator of belief. In peacetime, dreams and intuitions may be dismissed as curiosities, coincidences whispered over tea. But in war, when bullets rip the air and death lurks behind every ridge, every flicker of foresight feels like salvation. And in the world wars of the 20th century, stories of uncanny perceptions multiplied like wildfire. Imagine the trenches of the First World War. Mud swallows boots, the air stinks of damp earth and cordite, and the sky trembles with the thunder of artillery. Soldiers crouch in dugouts, waiting for the whistle that means they must climb into hell. In that crucible, nerves stretched thin, strange things happened. Men reported waking from sudden dreams of bombardments, only to hear the shells falling minutes later. Others claimed they felt an overwhelming urge to duck or shift just before a sniper's bullet cracked into the sandbag where their head had been. Coincidence, instinct, subconscious awareness. The soldier did not care. For him, it was life saved, fate averted. Letters home often hinted at these eerie sensations. A British private, writing in 1916, confessed to his mother, "It is as if someone whispers to me when danger is near. I cannot explain it, but I have learned to trust it. Twice now, it has saved me." His letter never made it to her. He died weeks later, but his testimony survived, another whisper in the chorus of war's mysteries. The Second World War brought even more. Pilots spoke of gut feelings that made them alter course, seconds before enemy fighters appeared. Sailors described dreams of ships sinking that proved hauntingly accurate. The phenomenon was so common that some officers began to quietly record instances, unsure whether to chalk them up to nerves or something stranger. One of the most chilling stories comes from Coventry, England, in 1940. A British intelligence officer named Wing Commander Sir Hugh Dowding, later head of Fighter Command, claimed that he had dreamt repeatedly of the city being bombed. He warned officials, but his concerns were dismissed. Days later, the Luftwaffe rained fire upon Coventry, leveling the city. Was this foresight? Or merely one of many dreams amplified by the tragedy that followed? Skeptics argued the latter. Believers were not so sure. And then there was Winston Churchill himself. He often spoke of a blessed instinct that guided him. Once, as Prime Minister, he changed cars at the last moment before traveling through London. The vehicle he had intended to ride in was later destroyed in a bombing raid. Churchill joked about luck, but those who knew him whispered about his uncanny sense for danger, a sixth sense that seemed to shield him when all else failed. Across the Atlantic, American soldiers reported similar experiences in the jungles of the Pacific. A Marine recounted lying awake one night, a gnawing certainty pressing into him. "Move your camp." He roused his squad, and though they mocked him, they shifted a short distance down the beach. Hours later, artillery fire tore through their original campsite. He never claimed to be psychic, but the others never doubted him again. Such stories blurred the line between survival instinct and extrasensory perception. Psychologists argued that under stress, the subconscious sharpened awareness to a razor's edge, picking up details unnoticed by the conscious mind. The brain, in this view, became a survival machine, predicting danger faster than thought. Yet to the soldiers who lived it, it felt like something more. Governments noticed. Whispers began to circulate about psychic warfare. If a soldier's intuition could save his life, could it be trained, enhanced, weaponized? During the Second World War, experiments were quietly conducted. In Britain, a handful of officials dabbled in dowsing rods to locate hidden bombs. In the United States, military intelligence collected reports of visions from ordinary citizens who claimed to foresee enemy attacks. Most were useless. Some were eerily accurate. None could be dismissed easily in a war where every scrap of intelligence mattered. Even the Soviets took note. Long before the Cold War's formal psychic programs, Russian folklore brimmed with tales of visionaries and seers. In wartime, rumors spread of officers consulting mystics, hoping for insight into battles. It is difficult to separate fact from legend, but the persistence of the stories reveals how deeply the human hunger for foresight ran when survival was on the line. And what of prophecy on the grand scale? Nostradamus, the 16th century seer, was resurrected in propaganda. Both Axis and Allied powers claimed his cryptic verses predicted victory for their side. German officers circulated pamphlets declaring Nostradamus had foreseen the downfall of Britain. In turn, the British Ministry of Information produced counter-pamphlets interpreting the same verses as proof that Hitler's Reich was doomed. Even in an age of tanks and bombers, ancient prophecy was pressed into service as a psychological weapon. For the ordinary soldier, though, prophecy was not in books, but in moments. A dream, a feeling, a shiver of certainty. These experiences, multiplied across millions, created a subterranean culture of belief. It was not written in official histories, but murmured in foxholes and barracks. The men laughed at superstition in the daylight, but at night, when the guns fell silent and death pressed close, they whispered otherwise. The wars proved something profound, that when pushed to the brink, humans turned to every possible tool, reason, instinct, and sometimes the inexplicable. ESP, in wartime, was not a parlor game. It was a question of survival. By 1945, as the Second World War ended and the Cold War began, these stories caught the attention of new kinds of minds: scientists, intelligence officers, military planners. If ESP could save a soldier on the battlefield, could it also serve in espionage, diplomacy, even global strategy? The seeds were planted. Soon, in secret rooms in Washington and Moscow, the whisper of the unknown would become something else entirely, a weapon of suspicion and imagination. The battlefield had given ESP a new kind of credibility, not as mysticism, but as a survival tool, a possible weapon. And as the world slid into the shadow of nuclear rivalry, governments would not forget. The whisper of the unknown was about to become the property of superpowers. Chapter 7: Cold War Mind Games. The Cold War was a war of shadows. No trenches, no front lines, but a constant hum of suspicion. Satellites stared down from orbit, spies whispered in back alleys, and governments hoarded secrets like treasure. In such a climate, even the impossible seemed worth considering. If nuclear annihilation could arrive in minutes, if a single secret could tilt the balance of power, then why not investigate whispers of the mind? And so ESP, once the subject of seances and spiritualists, was pulled into the halls of intelligence. Imagine a windowless office in Langley, Virginia, sometime in the 1970s. The fluorescent lights buzz faintly. On a table sits a set of photographs, sealed envelopes, coded maps. A man in plain clothes, his eyes closed, describes what he sees. A large building, domes, a river nearby. He has never been there, never seen it. Yet when the envelope is opened, the target is revealed, a Soviet installation thousands of miles away. The room falls silent. Some scoff, others lean forward. Could this be real? Could the mind itself become a tool of espionage? The CIA called it remote viewing. It began, as so many Cold War projects did, with fear. Rumors circulated that the Soviets were pouring money into psychic research. Reports, some exaggerated, some invented, claimed Russian scientists were training telepaths, teaching soldiers to kill goats with their minds, attempting to spy across oceans with nothing more than thought. To American intelligence, it didn't matter whether the rumors were true. What mattered was that they could be true. And in the Cold War, that was enough. So projects were born. Names changed: Scanate, Grillflame, Sunstreak, and finally Stargate. Behind those code names were experiments that sound more like science fiction than national security. In dimly lit rooms, viewers were given coordinates, sealed photos, or simple target numbers. Their task: describe what they saw. Sometimes the results were laughable. Sketches of mountains where there were none, rambling descriptions of empty fields. But sometimes, just sometimes, their visions matched reality with unsettling precision. One of the most famous accounts involved a remote viewer describing a new Soviet submarine under construction. The viewer sketched a vessel unlike any seen before, with features unknown to U.S. intelligence. Months later, satellite photos confirmed it. The Typhoon-class submarine, the largest ever built. Was it luck? Informed guesswork? Or something stranger? The Soviets, for their part, pursued their own psychic research. Reports emerged of telepathic experiments on cosmonauts, of attempts to use psychics to influence enemy leaders, even of studies on biolocation, their term for remote viewing. The lines between truth, rumor, and propaganda blur, but one thing is certain: both sides believed the other was doing it, and so neither could afford to stop. Picture a Soviet lab in the 1960s. The air smells of ozone from humming machines. Electrodes are taped to a subject's scalp, recording every flicker of brainwave. Across the room, another subject concentrates on a playing card, hidden in an envelope. Black square. He whispers. The researchers jot notes, their faces tight. Later, they will publish a paper hinting at success, though the numbers will never be convincing enough to silence doubt. Still, the funding continues, fueled less by proof than by paranoia. Back in the United States, the Army and Air Force also dipped their toes into psychic waters. Could a soldier sense a minefield before stepping into it? Could a remote viewer locate a hostage hidden in Beirut? Test after test followed. Sometimes they failed spectacularly. Other times, results were so uncanny that even skeptics hesitated. Yet the irony was this: while governments pursued ESP for war, many of the viewers themselves were not hardened soldiers or spies. They were often ordinary men and women artists, engineers, even former police officers who claimed to have an unusual gift. Their sessions were more meditative than militant. Sitting quietly, breathing deeply, sketching impressions that flickered into their minds. They were not James Bond with telepathy. They were humans staring inward, trying to catch whispers from the dark. For years, the projects remained secret, hidden in classified files. But word leaked, as it always does. Journalists uncovered hints, skeptics demanded proof, believers demanded disclosure. When finally declassified in the 1990s, the documents painted a picture both astonishing and ambiguous. Yes, some sessions produced startlingly accurate descriptions. Yes, the CIA and military funded it for decades. But no, the data was never consistent enough to make ESP a reliable weapon. The official conclusion: interesting but not useful. And yet the story refuses to end there. Even after the programs were shuttered, those who had participated swore the results were real. Former remote viewers spoke of their sessions with conviction, insisting they had touched something beyond ordinary senses. Skeptics shook their heads. The debate that had haunted shamans, saints, and scientists for centuries played out once again, this time in the age of nuclear missiles. The Cold War had turned ESP into a battlefield of the mind. Was it real? Was it fraud? Or was it something stranger, that in moments of fear and desperation, human perception sharpens, intuition peaks, and coincidence is mistaken for prophecy? Whatever the truth, the fact remains. Two superpowers spent time, money, and secrecy on the possibility that the mind itself could be a weapon. Picture the image one last time: a man in a government office, eyes closed, sketching what he cannot see. His pencil scratches across paper, lines forming into shapes: domes, towers, submarines. Outside, the Cold War ticks on, missiles pointed skyward. Inside, silence holds, as the watchers wonder, did he just touch the future? Or did he merely draw shadows from his own mind? The whisper of the unknown had never held such high stakes. In the Cold War, it was not curiosity, it was survival. Chapter 8: Science Enters the Room. By the 20th century, the world was a different place. Airplanes stitched across the sky, radios hummed with invisible voices, and telephones carried words along copper threads. Electricity, once magical, had become mundane. And in this world, ESP demanded to be tested not in candlelit parlors, but in laboratories, with experiments designed to strip away coincidence and trickery. If the mind truly reached beyond itself, then surely science could prove it. Enter J. B. Rhine, a botanist turned psychologist at Duke University in the 1930s. Picture his lab: clean white walls, fluorescent lights humming, the faint smell of chalk dust and paper. On a table lies a deck of specially printed cards, simple symbols: a star, 3 wavy lines, square, a circle, a cross. These became known as Zener cards. One subject would look at a card while another, seated apart, tried to guess which symbol it was. 5 options, a 20% chance of being right, by pure luck. But if guesses soared consistently above chance, Rhine argued, that would be evidence of extrasensory perception. Session after session, students and volunteers shuffled cards, guessed symbols, and tallied scores. Sometimes results fell where expected, around chance. But sometimes, certain individuals seemed to soar, hitting streaks far above the odds. One subject guessed 36 out of 50 correctly. The probability of doing that by chance? Astronomically small. Ryan was convinced ESP was real. He published papers, then books. The world took notice. Newspapers declared science had found proof of the sixth sense. Yet science is a jealous gatekeeper. Other researchers tried to replicate Ryan's results, and often failed. Critics accused him of flawed methods, of letting subtle cues slip through, perhaps a reflection in glasses, a shuffle pattern in the cards, unconscious hints in tone of voice. Skeptics argued that statistical anomalies are bound to appear if you test enough people often enough. Ryan, however, pushed on. To him, the occasional failure did not erase the remarkable successes. The debate raged. Imagine sitting in one of Ryan's lectures, the air buzzing with tension. Students leaned forward, some excited, others skeptical, as Ryan explained the mathematics of probability and how certain results defied it. Was it proof of the paranormal, or proof that statistics could mislead when wielded too eagerly? After Ryan, others took up the mantle. Dice were rolled thousands of times to test for psychokines. Could the mind influence matter? Sometimes the rolls skewed ever so slightly from chance. Was it proof? Or the law of large numbers playing tricks again? Computers later replaced dice and cards, spitting out random numbers for subjects to predict. Patterns seemed to appear, faint but persistent, just enough to keep hope alive. Meanwhile, societies for psychical research blossomed. Scientists, philosophers, and amateur enthusiasts gathered to debate, experiment, and publish. Journals filled with accounts of telepathy tests, clairvoyance trials, and statistical analyses. To some, this was the birth of a new science parapsychology. To others, it was pseudoscience dressed in lab coats. Yet behind the numbers were the stories of individuals who astonished researchers. Take Hubert Pierce, one of Ryan's star subjects, who consistently scored far above chance on card-guessing experiments. For a time, his results seemed unexplainable. But when replication failed elsewhere, skeptics claimed he must have picked up on subtle cues. Still, the legend remained. Perhaps some people truly had gifts, others did not. The tension was palpable. Science demanded replication, reliability, clear mechanisms. ESP, by its very nature, seemed slippery, appearing in bursts, vanishing when scrutinized. As if the very act of measurement scared it away. Researchers called this the shyness effect, a phenomenon that manifested strongly in casual settings but disappeared under pressure. Skeptics called it an excuse. Believers called it evidence that ESP did not obey ordinary laws. Beyond Rhine, labs sprouted across Europe and America. In the UK, the Society for Psychical Research conducted meticulous case studies of telepathy between twins, dreams that aligned with real events, and moments of sudden knowing. In the U.S., Princeton's PAIR Lab, Princeton Engineering, Anomalies, Research, ran experiments for decades, trying to see if the human mind could subtly influence random number generators. Results suggested faint but consistent deviations from chance, enough to tantalize but never enough to satisfy mainstream science. Picture one of those experiments. A volunteer sits before a computer, the screen flashing streams of numbers. Her task: influence. The outcome: make the machine produce more ones than zeros, simply by concentrating. She furrows her brow, heartbeat rising, hands clenched on the table. Minutes pass. Later, statisticians pore over the results. A tiny shift, just barely above chance. Too small to prove anything, too stubborn to dismiss. And always, the skeptics circled. They pointed to flawed methodologies, unconscious cues, outright fraud in some cases. They reminded the world that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and ESP had never delivered evidence extraordinary enough. Yet the research did not stop. Funding ebbed and flowed, but the mystery endured. What makes this chapter of the story so fascinating is the clash of languages, belief clothed in statistics, wonder translated into probability curves. Shamans once spoke of visions, Victorians spoke of spirits. Now scientists spoke of percentages and standard deviations. The essence had not changed the human hunger to know beyond knowing, but its costume had. Close your eyes and imagine yourself as a subject in Ryan's lab. You sit across from a researcher, the smell of ink and paper thick in the room. He lifts a card, glances at it, then places it face down. Your pulse quickens. You close your eyes, focusing, waiting for something to stir. A shape, faint and fleeting, 3 wavy lines. You speak it aloud. He flips the card. 3 wavy lines. You laugh nervously, unsure whether it was guesswork or something else. Again and again, the process repeats. Sometimes you are wrong. Sometimes startlingly right. And in the silence between guesses you wonder, is this real, or am I tricking myself? That is the question that haunted parapsychology. Was ESP real, or was the human mind so desperate for mystery that it conjured patterns from randomness? By the late 20th century, parapsychology stood at a crossroads. To its defenders, it had amassed enough intriguing data to warrant continued study. To its critics, it had failed to produce consistent, replicable results, and therefore belonged on the fringe. Yet regardless of the verdict, the very attempt to measure ESP had changed the narrative. It was no longer confined to shamans, prophets, or mediums. It was now part of scientific debate, tested with cards and numbers, dissected with the same rigor as any other phenomenon. The whisper of the unknown had entered the laboratory. And once inside, it refused to leave. Chapter 9. Skeptics Strike Back. By the middle of the 20th century, ESP had carved out a strange place in the cultural imagination. Scientists like J. B. Ryan had brought it into laboratories, governments had flirted with it as a weapon, and ordinary people swore by their dreams and intuitions. But for every story of eerie success, there was a skeptic sharpening his tools, ready to drag ESP back into the light and show it for what they believed was illusion, error, or outright fraud. Imagine a stage in New York in the 1970s. The lights are low, the crowd restless, waiting to be astonished. A man in a dark suit steps forward, Uri Geller, the Israeli performer whose claims of psychic power had made him an international sensation. He holds up an ordinary spoon, smiles, and rubs it lightly between his fingers. Slowly, impossibly, the metal bends. The crowd gasps. To the believers, this is proof of psychokines, is the mind bending matter. To the skeptics, it is sleight of hand, dressed in wonder. In the audience, a magician named James Randi watches closely. He has seen this trick before, though not from psychics, from magicians, illusionists, con artists. To Randy, Geller is not a man with powers, but a man with clever hands and a talent for drama. That night, Randy makes a vow to spend his life exposing fraud in the world of the paranormal. And so begins one of the fiercest counter-movements against ESP. James, the Amazing. Randy was not alone. Other magicians skilled in the art of deception joined him, arguing that those who claimed psychic powers were simply using stage tricks on audiences who did not know what to look for. To prove their point, Randy and his peers replicated the very feats psychics boasted about. They bent spoons, moved compasses with hidden magnets, even reproduced telepathy demonstrations using subtle signals between confederates. Watching them, you felt the rug pulled out from beneath the mystery. What looked like the paranormal in one light looked like trickery in another. But skeptics did not only target stage performers. They also turned their gaze on laboratories. Parapsychology experiments were re-examined, their statistics dissected. Psychologists pointed out flaws, insufficient controls, poor randomization, experimenter bias. In Rhine's famous card-guessing tests, skeptics suggested that tiny imperfections on the card backs might have given away clues. Even subconscious gestures from the experimenter, tone of voice, hesitation, the tiniest glance could leak information to the subject. Once again, the extraordinary shrank under the microscope. And when fraud was discovered outright, skeptics seized upon it with ruthless glee. In the 1970s, a pair of teenage subjects, Stephen North and Matthew Manning, claimed psychic gifts and participated in parapsychology tests. For a time, results looked remarkable. But later investigations revealed sleight of hand and deception. Each exposure tarnished not just the guilty subject, but the entire field. To the scientific establishment, ESP began to look less like a frontier of discovery and more like a carnival sideshow. The media joined the fray. Popular magazines ran exposes, television programs aired debunkings. Skeptics like Carl Sagan reminded audiences that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and ESP had never produced it. The language of science turned sharp. Confirmation bias. The file drawer problem. Pseudoscience. The very word ESP became a punchline in certain circles, shorthand for gullibility. Yet the battle was never so simple. For every fraud exposed, there remained cases not so easily explained. For every trick revealed, there were statistics that refused to vanish neatly into randomness. Skeptics shouted louder, believers grew more defensive, and the public caught in the middle found itself torn between wonder and dismissal. Close your eyes and imagine sitting in a television studio in 1975. The air smells of hot lights and dust. Uri Geller sits at a table, his hands trembling theatrically as he tries to bend keys and describe drawings sealed in envelopes. Across from him, James Randi smirks, his magician's mind racing through possible methods. The cameras roll, the audience holds its breath. When Geller falters, unable to perform under carefully controlled conditions, Randi pounces. To skeptics, it is proof of fraud exposed. To believers, it is proof that psychic abilities vanish under hostile eyes. Both sides leave convinced they are right. And this is the heart of the skeptic's challenge. ESP is elusive, inconsistent, difficult to pin down. To the scientist, that makes it unreliable, perhaps imaginary. To the believer, it makes it precious, something fragile, not suited to the harsh glare of the laboratory. By the end of the 20th century, the skeptics seemed to have the upper hand. Universities cut funding for parapsychology labs, scientific journals grew reluctant to publish studies, and ESP was increasingly lumped with astrology and fortune-telling. James Randi's $1 Million Challenge, a prize for anyone who could demonstrate psychic powers under controlled conditions, stood unclaimed year after year, a constant thorn in the side of believers. And yet people kept dreaming of the dead, kept feeling phone calls before they came, kept whispering of hunches that saved lives. Science and skepticism may have won the official battle, but in kitchens, bedrooms, and private diaries, the belief in ESP survived. The whisper of the unknown had been battered, mocked, and exposed, but it refused to die. Because skepticism, for all its power, cannot erase experience. And when an experience burns itself into your memory with the force of certainty, no debunker's argument can take it away. The clash between believers and skeptics left ESP in limbo, half buried by ridicule, half stained by human longing. It had become not just a question of science, but a question of identity. Do we live in a universe governed only by reason, or one haunted by whispers science has yet to name? Chapter 10: ESP in Popular Culture. By the late 20th century, ESP had slipped into a strange limbo. Scientists sparred over data, skeptics exposed fraud, governments quietly shelved their psychic programs. But in the imagination of the public, ESP was more alive than ever. And in the realm of popular culture, imagination mattered more than evidence. It began with books. Pulp magazines of the early 20th century were filled with heroes who could read minds, foresee danger, or project thoughts across continents. These were not dusty parapsychology reports. They were lurid, thrilling tales of the extraordinary. The superpowers, as they were often called, became shorthand for human potential untapped. Readers devoured them, hungry for a vision of the mind as more than neurons and chance. Then came cinema. Picture the flickering black and white screen of a 1940s theater. The smell of buttered popcorn drifts through the air. On screen, a detective pauses, his eyes narrowing as he senses danger lurking in the shadows. In the 1950s and 60s, as science fiction blossomed, ESP was everywhere: mutants with telepathy, alien visitors communicating without words, humans evolving into beings of pure mind. Cold War anxiety bled into these stories. If spies could steal secrets, could telepaths steal thoughts? If nuclear war loomed, could a psychic foresee catastrophe and stop it? By the 1970s, ESP had become a full-fledged pop phenomenon. Stephen King's Carrie terrified readers with a teenage girl whose psychic powers, telekinesis, fueled by rage, turn a prom into a nightmare. The Dead Zone told of a man who, after waking from a coma, sees glimpses of people's futures with a touch. These were not clinical experiments. They were raw, emotional, and unforgettable. Readers believed not in the science of ESP, but in its metaphorical power, the way it dramatized fear, hope, alienation, and possibility. On television, ESP became a staple. The X-Files in the 1990s turned psychic visions into weekly mysteries, wrapped in cigarette smoke and paranoia. Agent Mulder's quest for the paranormal, half belief, half desperation, mirrored the public's fascination. In another corner of pop culture, Star Trek envisioned a future where telepathy was real, an accepted skill of alien species, a bridge across silence. For millions, ESP was not a fringe claim. It was entertainment as familiar as the nightly news. And then came the movies that turned ESP into spectacle. In Ghostbusters, psychokinesis was both punchline and plot. In Stranger Things, decades later, a young girl named 11, her head shaved from sinister government experiments, uses her psychic powers to battle monsters from another dimension. The echo of real-life Cold War projects like Stargate is unmistakable. What was once secret history had become Netflix drama. But popular culture did more than entertain. It reshaped belief. People who might scoff at a laboratory study found themselves haunted by stories on screen. A teenager reading The Dead Zone wondered if his own dreams carried meaning. A mother watching The X-Files found herself remembering her grandmother's stories of visions. Pop culture blurred the line between fiction and possibility. And then there was the language of comics. Marvel and DC filled their pages with psychic heroes, Professor X, Jean Grey, Martian Manhunter. Telepathy, clairvoyance, psychokinesis became not fringe but superpowers, icons of human potential. Children reading those comics in the 1960s and 70s grew up seeing ESP not as superstition but as a symbol of evolution, the next step of humanity. Who needed proof when imagination was enough? The cultural impact was enormous. Ask someone today about ESP, and they are as likely to mention Stranger Things or The X-Files as Ryan's Zener cards or the CIA's Stargate program. Pop culture did what science could not. It made ESP unforgettable. But this popularity came with a paradox. For every believer inspired by a story, skeptics argued that pop culture cheapened the subject. ESP became entertainment, not evidence. When scientists tried to publish real studies, they found themselves competing with Stephen King and Hollywood. The line between inquiry and fantasy blurred, and serious research was often dismissed as fiction. Still, perhaps that is ESP's greatest victory, not improving itself in the lab, but improving itself in our imagination. Because imagination shapes belief, and belief shapes reality. Close your eyes for a moment. Remember the first time you saw a movie where a character knew something impossible, bent a spoon, or spoke without words. The thrill that coursed through you, the whisper that maybe, just maybe, it was possible. That whisper has followed humanity for centuries. Popular culture gave it a megaphone. And so, in theaters and living rooms, in novels and comic books, ESP became more than an experiment. It became a metaphor for hope, fear, and the untapped mystery of the human mind. The whisper of the unknown had become a roar of imagination. Chapter 11. Personal Testimonies. If the laboratories argue, the governments experiment, and the skeptics mock, it is the ordinary people who keep ESP alive. For it is not statistics or classified files that sustain belief, but the lived experience of someone who wakes in the night, shivering, certain something has happened to a loved one. No graph or debunking column can erase the memory of those moments. Take, for instance, the story of a mother in Ohio in the 1970s. Her son, serving in Vietnam, was thousands of miles away. One night, she awoke suddenly, her heart pounding. She swore she felt his presence in the room. She even spoke his name aloud. The next morning, a telegram arrived. He had been killed in action, the night before, at the exact moment she had awakened. Was it coincidence? Skeptics will say yes. But for her, no argument could erase the chill she felt in her bones. Or the case of twins. Across cultures, twins are said to share a mysterious bond. One in England described feeling a sudden, sharp pain in his chest one afternoon. Hours later, he learned his brother, living in Canada, had suffered a heart attack at precisely that time. Stories like these repeat so often across so many families that they form a folklore of their own. Science demands replication, but life delivers anecdotes, unforgettable in their power. Dreams are another common thread. A man in rural France dreamed vividly of a train derailing near his town. The image stayed with him, screeching metal, smoke, cries in the night. Days later, a freight train derailed on the very stretch of track he had seen. He told anyone who would listen. Was he one of thousands who dreamed nonsense and happened to match reality, or was his mind brushing against something hidden? He could not say. He only knew he would never forget. And then there are the hunches, the gut feelings that defy logic. A woman in Chicago described being late for work one morning. As she reached the train station, she felt an overwhelming urge not to board. She could not explain it. She turned back, embarrassed at her own nervousness. That day, a fire broke out on the very train she would have taken. No fatalities, but dozens injured. She lived the rest of her life, convinced her intuition, her sixth sense, had saved her. These testimonies rarely make headlines. They live in diaries, in conversations over kitchen tables, in late-night confessions to friends. They are messy, inconsistent, impossible to measure. Yet they are the beating heart of ESP. Because unlike laboratory experiments, they are charged with emotion, grief, fear, relief. And emotion etches memory deep, far deeper than any statistic. Critics remind us that memory itself is slippery. We forget the dreams that fail. We remember the ones that come true. We bend timelines, exaggerate details, weave stories from chance. And this is true. But to dismiss every testimony as error is to ignore the sheer weight of them. Millions of people across centuries, across cultures, whisper the same thing: I knew. Picture yourself at a family gathering. The air smells of roast chicken and wood polish. The laughter of children echoes through the room. An elderly aunt leans close, lowering her voice. She tells you of the night she dreamt of her sister's accident before the phone rang. She swears it happened. Her eyes shine with conviction. Do you dismiss her? Do you argue with her memory? Or do you feel, if only for a moment, the chill of possibility? Even today, in our world of smartphones and satellites, testimonies continue. Online forums overflow with people sharing their experiences, knowing who was calling, before checking their phone, dreaming of disasters that later unfolded, sensing tragedy in the instant it occurred. For every scoff, there is a quiet nod from someone who has felt the same. The testimonies are not proof. They cannot be replicated or measured. But they are the reason ESP refuses to die. Because science can dismantle theories, skeptics can expose fraud, governments can cancel programs, but they cannot reach into memory and erase the moments that feel realer than reality itself. And so, ESP survives not in the pages of journals, but in the hearts of ordinary people. It lives in the mother clutching a telegram, the twin gasping at a sudden pain, the commuter who turns back at the last second. It lives in the whispered words, "I can't explain it, but I know what I felt." The whisper of the unknown is most powerful not in laboratories or battlefields, but in kitchens, bedrooms, and quiet moments that define lives. Chapter 12. The Edge of Science. The 21st century prides itself on answers. We can map the genome, photograph black holes, and send rovers across Martian dust. Brain scanners trace electrical storms inside the skull, showing thoughts like flickers of lightning. And yet, even here, at the supposed pinnacle of knowledge, the whisper of ESP refuses to vanish. Instead, it has shifted its mask once again from temples and seance tables into MRI machines and quantum equations. Picture a modern neuroscience lab. White walls, the steady hum of air conditioning, a faint antiseptic smell. A volunteer lies in an fMRI scanner, their head encased in a cradle, eyes closed. A researcher in a lab coat peers at glowing images on a monitor, blobs of color, representing oxygen flow in the brain. The task: one subject in another room is shown images, an apple, a dog, a cathedral, while the person in the scanner tries to guess what their partner is seeing. It is telepathy dressed in modern clothes, stripped of incense and mysticism. Results remain ambiguous, but the experiments continue. Why? Because even in the most rational of times, the possibility that the mind can reach beyond itself is too tantalizing to abandon. Mainstream psychology leans toward skepticism. Studies on intuition, déjà vu, and coincidence suggest that our brains are masters of shortcuts. We absorb subtle cues, we notice patterns without conscious awareness, we misremember the timeline of dreams. What feels supernatural may often be natural, the subconscious bubbling into awareness. And yet, not every finding fits neatly. Some statistical anomalies persist, faint but stubborn, like echoes of something not yet understood. Meanwhile, quantum physics has been drafted, sometimes recklessly, into the conversation. Quantum entanglement, particles separated by light years, influencing each other instantly. To some, it offers a metaphor, perhaps even a mechanism. If particles can be linked across space, could minds be linked as well? Physicists caution that such leaps are poetic, not scientific. But the allure remains. A human longing whispers, maybe ESP is the mind's brush with the quantum fabric of reality. Outside the lab, technology has reshaped the debate. We live tethered to devices that anticipate our needs, algorithms that know what we want before we ask. If a machine can predict our choices by crunching data, is it so impossible that our minds might, in some other way, glimpse the future? For many, the distinction blurs. A phone buzzing at the moment we think of someone feels like ESP, even if it is coincidence. The boundary between intuition, probability, and the paranormal is thinner than ever. And yet, skepticism remains fierce. The James Randi Educational Foundation's $1 Million Challenge expired unclaimed after decades of failed attempts. The scientific consensus is blunt. No replicable evidence of ESP has ever been found. Ask a neuroscientist, and they will tell you the brain is wondrous enough without inventing telepathy. Ask a psychologist, and they will explain confirmation bias, selective memory, and the law of large numbers. But ask ordinary people, and the answer shifts. Polls show that even in our rational age, a majority of humans believe in ESP in some form. They believe because they have felt it. They believe because culture feeds it through films and novels. They believe because, deep down, it comforts them to think we are connected in ways science cannot measure. Close your eyes and imagine a near future. A group of researchers gather around a computer in a dim lab. A subject has just produced results, numbers, predictions, patterns that tilt ever so slightly against chance. The scientists murmur, frowning, wondering if they've glimpsed something real. Is it noise? Is it error? Or is it the first crack in the wall of the known? That tension, the maybe, the what if, is the air ESP continues to breathe. At the edge of science, ESP hovers like a mirage. Some call it illusion, others call it a frontier not yet reached. Perhaps it will one day be explained entirely by neuroscience, the subconscious mind, sharpened and strange, creating the illusion of foresight. Perhaps it will fall into the dustbin of history, another myth we clung to too long. Or perhaps, just perhaps, the tools of tomorrow will finally catch what has always eluded us, and the whisper of the unknown will become a voice. Until then, ESP remains what it has always been, a question. A hope. A story we tell ourselves about the possibility that the mind is more than matter, more than electricity in the skull. Whether real or imagined, it endures because humans cannot bear to live without mystery. The whisper has never left us. It lingers still at the border between reason and wonder, inviting us to lean closer, to ask again, what if? From the firelit caves of our ancestors to the white-lit laboratories of today, the story of extrasensory perception has followed us like a shadow. It has worn many names: prophecy, second sight, telepathy, intuition. It has been revered by kings, feared by priests, tested by scientists, and mocked by skeptics. And yet, across every century, across every continent, it has endured. What are we to make of it? Perhaps ESP is nothing more than coincidence dressed in wonder, the subconscious whispering truths we do not recognize until later. Perhaps it is the mind's way of finding order in chaos, of clinging to meaning in a world that feels random. Or perhaps, just perhaps, it is a glimpse of something real, something that lies beyond the limits of our five senses, waiting for tools we have not yet built. But whether real or illusion, one truth remains: ESP reveals more about us than about the universe. It shows our hunger for connection, our terror of uncertainty, our refusal to accept that we are bound entirely by flesh and bone. It is a mirror of our deepest longings, the hope that we can reach beyond ourselves, touch the thoughts of another, glimpse the future before it arrives. Science may one day settle the question, or it may not. Skeptics may laugh, believers may cling, but the whisper remains. Because as long as there are dreams that come true, as long as there are hunches that save lives, as long as someone, somewhere, feels the chill of knowing without knowing why, ESP will live on. And maybe that is the real story. Not whether extrasensory perception exists in the way we imagine, but that we cannot stop imagining it. Because imagination itself is a kind of sixth sense, a bridge to possibilities not yet proven, but never entirely dismissed. The whisper of the unknown has followed us for millennia. It follows us still. And as long as we wonder, it will never fade.